Hi everybody, my name is Maureen Smith and I facilitate the local branch of Celtic Women International, local Chicago branch I should say. I first heard of Grace O'Malley or Granuaile, Ireland's pirate queen, several years ago and read about her periodically or saw her name periodically, and finally I bought one of the excellent biographies about Granuaile written by Anne Chambers. In addition to multiple books, including one for children, Chambers has a wonderful website with a lot of information. But Granuaile, she wasn't Granuaile's only even first biographer. For example, while the people of the west coast of Ireland had this long oral history of Granuaile, they didn't include her in many of the published histories of the region. John O'Donovan is said to have collected some of the local traditional stories in the 1830s and 40s as part of the Ordnance Survey of Ireland. We also learn more about her from a series of responses she gave to questions posed by Queen Elizabeth called interrogatories, which we'll discuss a bit later. Let's look at the O'Malleys, the O'Malley family. They had a long history as being intrepid seafarers, at least back to the 12th century. Their mobility gave them a lot of advantages, including the ability to escape from their enemies. And piracy itself has been in existence for over 5,000 years in almost every civilization. Think about Vikings attacking Ireland, for example. Let's take a look at the type of boats that O'Malley's would have used. Now, couriers were probably familiar with the galleys. Galleys were kind of their workhorses. They had a shallow draft so they could pull in closer to the shores, the rocky shores. They were long and narrow, maybe influenced by the Viking longships. They had 1 to 3 masts. They could carry up to 300 men. That's a big ship. And then they had wind power, but also they had oars, rowing power. One of them actually had, I think it was like 200 oars. So you think about some poor ship, some treasure ship coming up from Spain or Portugal, going to up the west coast of Ireland, which is the route they would have to take. They're dependent totally on wind power. And then this came to greet them with a couple of hundred oars, rowing, attaching itself. You can't maneuver because you're dependent on wind power. They would attach, and then you were pretty much in dire straits. Grace O'Malley was born about 1530 in Amal, a district of West Connaught at the time of Henry VIII of England, during which time England was conquering parts of Ireland and giving land, some of the seizing land. Grace's father was head of the O'Malley clan, or family rather, one of the seafaring families of Connaught. Her father traded materials in exchange, raw materials in exchange for luxury items. He ferried Scottish mercenaries. He fished, he plundered, he engaged in opportunistic piracy, and he levied a toll on all shipping that came up along the O'Malley territory, the O'Malley waters. Grania had a paternal half-brother, Donal, but he wasn't interested in the sea at all. Whereas Grania took to the sea at a very early age. She was her father's only legitimate heir. She sailed with him on his voyages, again, from an early age, 3 or 4 or 5, somewhere around in there. Well, the little is known about Grania's education. Sources exist that demonstrate that 16th century women, such as herself, were relatively well educated. And we know, for example, that Grace was conversant in Latin when she met with Queen Elizabeth, because that's how they taught, how they conversed. She may also have been at least conversant in Spanish, French, maybe Scots Gaelic, acquired during her sea voyages. But interestingly enough, she did not speak English. As was customary with the Celts at the time, girls were married in arranged marriages starting at age 14 or so. Grace herself was married to Donal O'Flaherty in an arranged marriage in 1546 when she was 16 years of age. Again, it was an arranged marriage, a custom, Celtic custom, and the purpose of the custom was to strengthen bonds between families. A person would be less likely to attack a second family if their daughter were living there. Donal was the Tanist, or the heir apparent to the O'Flahertys, the head of the O'Flaherty clan, in other words, inherent to the head of the clan. Grania brought a considerable dowry in terms of gold coins, other gold bars, cattle, and probably ships. Under Brehon law, that dowry could be used by her husband, but had to be returned intact on dissolution of a marriage, whether it was by divorce or death. Grace had 3 children by Donal. Owen, who is described as kind and forgiving. Maeve, or Margaret, much like her mother. Her husband actually, Maeve's husband, probably saved Grace from death more than once in her later life. And then there was Merle. He took after his father with his love of warfare and such. He later betrayed the family and joined forces with Bingham, that we'll talk about later. As was common, her oldest son, Owen, was fostered out. Now, what is fostered? It was a Celtic or an Irish Celtic custom where children were given to another family. The whole idea, again, is creating stronger bonds between different families, different families. And it had a lot of very strict Brehon law regarding such things as education, how the child would be educated, clothes, and other details. Grania, this didn't mean she was abandoning her. She visited her children several times a week. Well, Donal O'Flaherty was quick-tempered and impetuous and constantly feuding with other clans, so Grace gradually eclipsed him and assumed the mantle of the O'Flaherty chieftainship, actively engaging in politics, intrigue, tribal disputes, fishing and trading and such. They traded with Munster, Ulster, Scotland, Spain, and Portugal. Again, these long distances. She would swoop down in her fast galleys and attack slower merchants. She would negotiate with captive ship captains for a suitable price for safe passage. It's very similar to her father. However, in 1565, Donal was killed in a territorial skirmish with the Joyces in his attempt to capture one of their castles. Grace fought. The next day, Grace returned and fought on and defeated them, earning the title of the Hen. And the castle here was henceforth called Hen's Castle. Under Gaelic law, or Brehon law, I should say, I keep calling it Gaelic, Granuaile was unable to inherit O'Flaherty land, so she returned to Amal, or Owl, whatever, and settled on Clare Island in Clew Bay. She now had complete control of her own property and began to earn her livelihood in earnest by land and sea. At the time, she had 3 galleys and a number of smaller boats. Clare Island was the ideal setting to monitor ship traffic going up and down the west coast of Ireland. Between piracy and charging safe passage, along with piloting ships, she did really well for herself and her followers, and later claimed that circumstances forced her to take up arms and maintain herself and her people by land and sea. The extent of her activities is hard to assess, but she's credited with accounts from Donegal to Waterford. Thus, the legend of the Pirate Queen was born. As mentioned with regards to ships from Spain, she engaged in an opportunistic form of piracy, comprising short-distance raids along the coast or to different islands, levying tolls on passing shipping, and plundering every vessel foolish enough to be unprotected, very much like what her father did, right? Now, the only portion of Clew Bay that was not in her hands was the Carrihowley Castle, or Rockfleet, which was owned by Richard and Aaron, or Richard Burke, as he was also called. He was also called Iron Dick Burke. So around 1567, she proposed and married him in a kind of early Celtic Irish marriage called a 1 year certain, where either party could terminate the marriage after 1 year. This was one of the various marriage contracts under Brehon law that was really a contract for mutual benefits of the participants. Divorce is very simple. It was more like a business transaction, and she was noted again as being the dominant partner in the marriage. Grania had one son with Burke, named Tibbet Nalong, or Tibbet is how he was called, Theobald of the ships. He was reportedly born aboard one of her ships while it was at high seas. Ooh, think of that. The day after his birth, the ship was attacked by pirates. Grania cursed the captain when he told her, but then stormed on deck, and under her command, they won the fight, dispatched the attackers, and they captured the. After a year, and after Granuaile had thoroughly installed herself in Rockfleet Castle, when Richard Burke returned from one of his battles, she called down from the ramparts, "I divorce thee." She called down, "I divorce thee," 3 times, which is a method of divorce recognized under Brehon law, and thus she secured the castle for herself. But they kind of still kept up some type of a relationship, and when he was knighted, and when he was knighted, she took the title Lady Burke, and it accompanied him to official functions. Let's take a look now at Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth has addressed her issues with other European countries at this point, including having her own sister, Mary, Queen of Scots, beheaded. Faced with large debts from her European action, Queen Elizabeth tightened England's control over Ireland by paying some of its debts with land in Ireland. What she did was, first of all, she looked at all of the English landowners who had owned their land for many years, and had them all go through kind of a loyalty test and regranted their land if they pledged their support for her. Then she paid off her debts by granting other parts of Irish land to those Englishmen that she owed so much money to. And they really liked this because it meant that they could give them to their younger sons, and their younger sons could have titles. So it was kind of very good for them and not so good for the Irish. By 1577, Grace later she had set out to plunder Desmond, but was captured by the Earl of Desmond. He turned her over to the English governor, and she was brought to Dublin Castle in chains. She spent 2 years there, was released in 1579 on the pretext of trying to rein in her former husband, Burke. Instead, she returned to Rockfleet and started attacking shipping again, try to get up some more money. In April of 1583, Richard Burke died of natural causes, and this time Grace acted quickly to ensure she got her widow's amount, which under Brehon law would have been a third of his assets. She then gathered her followers, along with about 1,000 herd of cows and mares, and moved to Carrickcollie and secured Rockfleet Castle as her base. No doubt she took her entire fleet of ships. She appears to have decided at this point to have the best of both legal systems, Brehon law, but also this new English law. She was now 53 years old and a wealthy and independent woman. However, her troubles were really just beginning. Enter Richard Bingham. In 1584, Richard Bingham was made provincial president of Connaught and charged with imposing obedience there. While his predecessor chose to follow a conciliatory route, Bingham preferred a confrontational method. He ordered his brother John to seize the land of Grania's oldest son Owen, and then had Owen murdered. Bingham claimed that Owen was a prisoner who was trying to escape. He identified Grace as a source of trouble and took her second son, Tibbet, that's her youngest son actually, her youngest son, Tibbet, and had him incarcerated in Dublin Castle for a year. By late 1587, the Burke's rebellion had collapsed, and Bingham was sent to Flanders to aid the Dutch against Spain. In his absence, Grace and her children were granted a full pardon for their past offenses by Bingham's replacement, Sir John Perrott. But in 1588, Bingham was back in Ireland and ordered his troops to prosecute Grace and her followers again. While she was at sea one time, Bingham devastated her lands in Carrickowley. She learned that her middle son, Murrough, had sided with Bingham, so she burned and pillaged his town and kind of wrote that son off. In 1582, her son Tibbet initiated a rising and attacked Bingham. Bingham in return plundered her territory, impounded her fleet, and left her penniless without any way of rebuilding. Grania was, having lost everything, appealed directly to the Queen. Despite Bingham's protests, she pleaded age and poverty and requested some reasonable maintenance and the return of some of her property in return for total allegiance to the Queen. Queen Elizabeth agreed to hear her petition and have her claim investigated. But while Grace's petition was en route to London, the Earl of Tyrone was secretly acting to begin a rebellion against the Queen, and her youngest son, Tibbet, was implicated, was arrested, and charged with treason. And treason was one of those offenses that was punishable by death. Fearing that Tibbet would be executed before even being justly tried, Grace sailed for London. She was at court from June to September, during which time she received and replied to the Lord Treasurer Burleigh's 16 articles of interrogatory. Grace's responses to the interrogatory questions were succinct and well thought out. Written in her own handwriting, they are perhaps the only physical evidence of Grania's level of education and are still in existence today. And here are images of these interrogatories. You could see her handwriting. I suppose if you had a good enough copy, you could actually read them, except they probably weren't in English. They probably were in Latin. Well, Bingham was outraged, and he wrote the court that he had enough evidence since her pardon to hang her. Elizabeth agreed to hear Grania's petition, however, and to have her claim investigated. The only charge actually against her was her chastisement of Murrough for supporting Elizabeth. The rest of and Murrough was her middle son. The rest of the charges were dismissed. The Queen recommended the release of Tibbet and monies be diverted from taxes on her son's estates to Grania. Bingham was ordered to protect them to live in peace and enjoy their livelihoods. Now, isn't this a lovely picture? There's the Queen here, and here is Grania. They conversed in Latin because, of course, Grace knew no English, and the Queen didn't know any Irish. So, well conversant in Latin. Well, Bingham was reluctant, but he ordered her troops to accompany her home, and then he wasn't supposed to prosecute her or attack her, but what he did was he stationed a detachment of troops on her land, like 200 soldiers on her land, which obliged her to feed them. So on the brink of poverty from all of that type of expense, Grace once again reached out to support from Elizabeth. A commission was granted to investigate these new claims, and Bingham was fearing that she had brought charges against him. He fled Ireland, and in one account he fled to Scandinavia. The other account he fled to England, where he was imprisoned. In 1595, Red Hugh O'Donnell established his own candidate as the McWilliam, took hostages, and repeatedly plundered Mayo, specifically attacking Grania. Again, she set about trying to rebuild the only way she knew. She had two choices, support Elizabeth or O'Donnell. Tibbet reached an advantageous accommodation with the Crown of a pension of £200 to him, Grace, and his half-brother for their services. The last official record of Granuaile dates to 1651, when the captain of an English airship reported a brief engagement with a galley, rowed by 30 oars, and had on board 100 good shot. The galley came out of Connaught and belonged to Grace O'Malley. Granuaile is believed to have died in 1603. And that's the story of Grace O'Malley. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of IBAM.